Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and for over a decade I have been exploring the overwhelming evidence which shows that the world's ancient myths are built on celestial metaphor. That's why, when I hear the periodic declarations that we are again approaching an end of the world prophecy, I know that these predictions are either coming from a misunderstanding of ancient myths and scriptures, which are describing celestial events rather than literal terrestrial events, or else they're coming from a deliberate attempt to deceive by people who know that the ancient myths and scriptures are not literal, but who want to use the widespread misunderstanding of those myths to advance some agenda. Recently, in a conversation with Sam Tripoli, Xavier Guerrero, and Johnny Woodard on the Tinfoil Hat podcast, I was asked this question by Xavier Guerrero, who's been wondering about these end-of-the-world prophecies that have resurfaced in the year 2020.
Dude, it's crazy, man. It's
It is
just
crazy.
crazy. It just makes me believe that there's been several civilizations.
Well, and they're all using the same system. So the same system is in play in the myths of the Pacific. They're
Hey,
using
David,
the same system.
what do you think about the Aztecs and the Aztec calendar and the whole? Were they right on the whole astrology?
well,
Yeah,
that's a big thing right now. They say December 21st is supposed to be.
Yeah.
They said the Romans effed up the calendar by 10 years.
Yeah, so
This is supposed to be the actual.
8 years.
Or 8
so
years,
2012
excuse
to
me.
2020. No, it is a good question. So XG, the Maya. So I believe that all those stories about the Revelation, the apocalypse, the Ragnarok stories of the Norse myths have to do with that processional shifting, and they're using it in a metaphorical way. It's not the literal end of the world. So in 2012, I was writing about that. It's not the end of the world. Just because the Maya calendar decides to reset, it's talking about processional shifts. And now the 8-year thing, first of all, when we switched from a Julian calendar to a Gregorian calendar, they did that because it's related to the leap year. They had to change, okay, is it 364.24, 364.25? How long is the day? They actually shaved 11 minutes off of the day.
What?
They didn't shave 11 minutes off the day, Sam. What they did was they adjusted the calendar. They adjusted the leap year so it didn't happen every 4 years in every single year. So if a year ends in 00, they won't put the leap year in there. They won't put the leap day in there. And what that effectively did was
Over years, thousands of years.
11 minutes.
Yeah.
But there's a guy on Twitter who said, oh, they shaved 11 days off of each year. So if they shaved 11 days, it's 11 minutes. But he said 11 days. If they shaved 11 days off each year, then we must have lost 8 years between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. And therefore, 2012 is 2020. And we're still in 2012. That's totally wrong. That guy was either confusing or deliberately confusing 11 minutes with 11 days. We're not really in 2012, but that has to do with this calendar system, which is imposed by who? The Pope Gregory. Now, that answer that I gave actually requires some illustration, especially the parts about the differences between the Julian and Gregorian calendar systems. So I'm going to explain that with illustrations, just to be sure that there's absolutely no confusion. In the run-up to 2012, I was already writing blog posts which explained that the end of the Maya calendar had to do with the shifting of processional ages. The shifting of procession slowly delays the background of stars and causes the sun to rise against a different set of celestial features after thousands of years, ushering in a new celestial age, which was described in the ancient traditions as a new world, a new heaven, and a new earth. You can go back and read those blog posts regarding precession in the Maya calendar, many of which point to the pioneering work of the late John Major Jenkins, whose analysis shows that the Maya calendar may well have been pointing towards the time when the winter solstice sunrise, the rebirth sunrise, would take place against the backdrop of the dark rift in the Milky Way galaxy, which was seen as a heavenly birth canal by the ancient Maya, thus representing renewal and a new sun, a new birth of the sun, a new world and a new age, and therefore a new cycle requiring a new calendar. In more recent years, I've also made videos explaining that the predicted end of the world in 2017 and 2019, based on the interpretations of passages in the New Testament book of the Revelation of John, were also sensationalistic and manipulative. You can see those videos, which I published prior to the predicted ends of the world, online on my YouTube channel using some of the links above. In books that I've written, such as Star Myths of the World Volume 3, Star Myths of the Bible, and Star Myths of the World Volume 4, Norse Mythology, I've presented abundant analysis demonstrating that the descriptions of the apocalypse in the Bible and the descriptions of the great day of Ragnarok in the Norse myths are based on the stars and are filled with processional imagery, and that these so-called end-of-the-world texts have to do with the end of a celestial age rather than with a literal end of the world on earth, a terrestrial end of the world. And I explain in many of my books and writings that this great displacement caused by the motion of precession is used by the ancient myths as a symbol for our own displacement and separation from the self, which is a central theme in ancient myth. We see this theme of displacement corresponding to precession very clearly in the Odyssey of ancient Greece, for example, in which Odysseus is displaced from his proper home by the usurping schemes of suitors who are explicitly said to be 108 in number, which is a clear indication of precession, just as the number of heroes who will march out of the halls of Valhalla in the Elder Edda of Norse mythology are described as numbering 432,000, which is another precessional number. The authors of Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969, point out the presence of this precessional number in the Ragnarok prophecy of the Elder Edda, and they explicitly state that the, quote, end of the world myths in various cultures and traditions are not describing terrestrial apocalypses, but rather a shifting of precessional ages, which the shifting brings about a whole new world in the system of celestial metaphor underlying ancient myth. For instance, at one point in Hamlet's Mill, the authors declare, on page 62, quote, "On the zodiacal band there are 4 essential points which dominate the 4 seasons of the year. They correspond to the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. Those 4 points together made up the 4 pillars or corners of what was called the quadrangular earth. This is an essential feature that needs more attention, since the 4 constellations rising heliacally at the 2 equinoxes and 2 solstices determine and define an earth. It is termed quadrangular. And since constellations rule the 4 corners of the quadrangular earth only temporarily, such an earth can rightly be said to perish, and a new earth to rise from the waters, with 4 new constellations rising at the 4 points of the year." End quote. Now, earlier in this year, in June of 2020, some of us began to hear the argument, which has been spread around, apparently starting on Twitter, that the end of the world that was widely anticipated in 2012 was actually off by 8 years, and that because of a shift in calendars from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, we're actually now, in 2020, in the year that the Maya calendar was calling our year 2012, and that the world will end in 2020, which should really be called 2012. Most of this talk was predicting the world's end on June 21st, 2020. That is, on the June solstice for this year, the summer solstice for the Northern Hemisphere. And once again, I wrote a blog post explaining why that talk was misguided, which you can go back and check out, that blog post from June of this year. However, after the world did not end on June 21st of this year, we now have some people saying that it will end on December 21st of 2020 instead. Again, because we're supposedly really in the year 2012 due to an 8-year disconnect caused by the switch from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, which I'm going to explain in a moment. Notice that these ends of the world are often predicted to occur on a solstice date, such as June 21st or December 21st. That was true back in 2012 as well. So that should right away be a strong clue that the end of the world events described in ancient myth have to do with the shifting of the celestial ages described, for instance, by the authors of Hamlet's Mill in the quotations that we just looked at, rather than with a literal and terrestrial apocalypse, the way that those who are trying to use these ancient concepts in order to instill some kind of fear or trauma in people would like you to believe. Second, this whole concept about an 8-year calendar shift due to the switch from the Julian system to the Gregorian system is false. And it's based on someone deliberately taking a change of what amounts to 11 minutes per year on average over hundreds of years and trying to argue that it represents a change of 11 days per year. So let me try and illustrate that for you. Calendar systems are designed to help us know where we are in relation to the various heavenly cycles, and in particular in relation to the cycle of the earth and the sun. We'll set aside at the moment the fact that all ancient calendar calculations, or virtually all ancient calendars, used to incorporate the cycles of the earth and the moon as well as the earth and the sun, rather than just focusing on the earth and the sun. We'll set that whole discussion aside and we'll look at the transition from the Julian calendar, which is a solar calendar, to the Gregorian calendar, which is a solar calendar. When literalist Christianity took over, it basically went with a solar-only calendar. We'll also set aside the question of the model of the solar system itself. For the purposes of this discussion, it doesn't matter if the Earth is going around the sun, as proposed by the conventional Keplerian model, or if the sun is going around the Earth, or the sun going around a binary companion with the Earth in between the two, as proposed by, for instance, Simon Schack in his TYCHOS model, which I discuss in a different video. Either model has to account for what we see in our observations from Earth. And what we can observe is that there is not a whole number of Earth days, which brings us back to the exact same point on our cycle with the sun. So, therefore, we have to manipulate the calendar. We can't have just an even number of days for each year, or else the calendar is going to start to drift away from the actual solar cycle, the relationship of the Earth and the sun each year in the solar cycle. And we'll end up having January in the middle of summer at some point. Ancient systems would bring back the calendars into agreement with the actual Earth and Sun cycle in a variety of different ways, such as inserting extra days every so often, which were called intercalary days. Or in a lunar solar system, they would actually insert extra months periodically, extra lunar months. In the Julian system, which is a solar system, an additional day was added every 4th year. And so we're familiar with that system because we know about having a leap year every 4th year in the calendar system that we use today. However, if you insert an extra day every 4 years, as in the Julian system, your calendar will actually still drift away, not as fast as if you didn't have them, but it will still drift away from the observed solar cycle because you're actually inserting too many days. You're inserting them too frequently. So in the 1500s, a correction to the Julian system was proposed, which would correct that problem. And this system was adopted by Pope Gregory XIII in October of 1582. Under the Gregorian system, an extra day would be added every 4 years, just like in the Julian system, but because doing it every 4 years is actually too often, the Gregorian system would not insert an extra day in the calendar during years that are divisible by 100. Evenly divisible by 100. In other words, in years ending in 00. However, removing leap years every time a year is divisible by 00 actually removes too many leap years. And so the calendar will still drift. So the Gregorian system adds one additional rule. If the year ending in 00 is evenly divisible by 400, then it does get a leap day. So the Gregorian system inserts an extra day every 4th year unless divisible evenly by 100, but if divisible evenly by 400, then the no leap year on 100 rule is suspended that year, and that year does get a leap year. So, for example, the year 1700, which would be a leap year under the Julian system, does not get its extra day because 1700 is evenly divisible by 100. Same thing for the year 1800, which is divisible by 100. Even though it has an 8 in it, 1800 is not divisible by 400 evenly because 4 does not go evenly into 18. So 1800 does not get a leap year, doesn't get an extra day added to it. Same with the year 1900. No leap year that year under the Gregorian system. However, the year 2000 does get an extra day because even though it's divisible by 100, it is also evenly divisible by 400. 4 goes into 20 evenly, so 400 goes into 2000 evenly. So 2000 was a leap year. And the same thing was true for 1600 for the states that had adopted the Gregorian calendar. 1600 ends in 00, but because it's divisible by 400 evenly, 4 goes into 16 4 times, and 400 goes into 1600 4 times. So 1600 becomes a leap year under the Gregorian system. Now, let's see what the removal of those leap years does for the difference between the Julian and the Gregorian systems. In the Julian system, the average length of the year is very easy to calculate. It's a system that repeats every 4 years in a very simple pattern. We get a year with 365 days, followed by another year with 365 days, and then we get a third year with 365 days, and then we add a day in the 4th year to get 366 days. That would be a leap year. So I put an asterisk there to indicate a leap year. And then that whole system is going to repeat itself. So you only need 4 years to figure out the average because it repeats every 4 years. So if you add those up, you see that in the cycle of 4 years, you get 1,461 days. Divide that by 4 years, and you will determine that in the Julian system, the average is 365.25 days per year. Now note, it doesn't mean that any particular year is going to have a quarter day in it. There's no 0.25 day added to any particular year. We adjust the calendar every 4th year so that it doesn't slip too far from the actual solar cycle. You don't get an extra 0.25 of a day where you can go to the pub or the bar and stay out an extra, 6 hours because you got an extra quarter day 1 year. It's an average over 4 years. But that adjustment every 4th year actually overcompensates. So the Julian system needed correction. So the Gregorian system removes some of those leap years from the pattern. So let's take a look at the Gregorian system. In the Gregorian system, we also have a leap year every 4th year, and I'm going to mark those with an asterisk, just like I did over on the Julian side. And let's start in the year 1601. As we go along, everything is the same in the Julian system until we get to the year 1700, in which case we will not add a leap year in the Gregorian system because 1700 is divisible by 100. It ends in 00. So we have a difference here from the Julian system, and I've marked that year's count of 365 days in red to show that it's different from what we would have had if we were following the Julian system, which would have put a leap year in 1700 and would have had 366 days. Now continuing along, we again insert an extra day every 4 years until we get to 1800, which once again is not a leap year, because in the Gregorian system you don't add a leap year if divisible by 100 unless it's also divisible by 400, which 1800 is not. So 1800 does not get to be a leap year in the Gregorian system, even though it would have been in the Julian system. And now if we add up all these days, we'll get to a count of 73,048 days in that 200-year block that I just showed, which would be 365.24 days per year on average over 200 years. However, the Julian system repeats every 4 years, but the Gregorian system doesn't repeat every 4 years, obviously. It doesn't even repeat every 200 years. It actually repeats over a period of 400 years, not just 200 years, because of that extra rule about having a leap year if the year is divisible by 400. So we need to look at 200 more years as well. So if we put in from 1801 and continue on, we'll see that 1900 is not a leap year in the Gregorian system. It would have been a leap year in the Julian system. But the year 2000 actually is a leap year in the Gregorian system because it is divisible by 400. So counting this whole 400-year cycle, all the days, we get 146,097 days in the 400-year period under the Gregorian system, which works out to an average of 365.2425 days per year in the Gregorian system. And the best way to calculate that, if you want to do it yourself, is to use a spreadsheet. Don't try and do 400 years on a calculator. You might make a mistake. But a spreadsheet is how I did it. And you can figure out that there's a total of 146,097 days in that 400-year period, and that works out to 365.2425 days per year in the Gregorian system. Now note again that no single year actually has a fractional 0.2425 days tacked onto it. That is an average that we get by looking at a whole course of 400 years in which the calendar is periodically adjusted by adding intercalary days every 4th year, except in years ending in 00, but adding it in years ending in 00, which are divisible evenly by 400. So what is the difference in that average solar year under the Julian system versus the average solar year in the Gregorian system? Well, we've seen that the average year in the Julian system is 365.25 days long, but in the Gregorian system, the average year is 365.2425 days long. The difference between those two averages, which we can get by subtracting 0.2425 from 0.25, is 0.0075 days. That's the difference. Now, everybody knows what 0.0075 days is, right? No. How long is 0.0075 days? Well, it's much easier to grasp if we look at it in terms of minutes. One day has 1,440 minutes, which you can easily determine for yourself if you multiply 24 hours per day times 60 minutes per hour to get 1,440 minutes per day. Then, if you multiply 1,440 minutes per day times 0.0075 days, which is the difference, then we're going to find out that the result is 10.8 minutes. That is to say, the difference between the average Julian day and the average Gregorian day is 10.8 minutes, or 11 minutes. So, at West Point, when you get to the answer on a long math problem, you underline it 2 times using a straight edge, and then you write ANS period for answer underneath, following the centuries-old Thayer system instituted by Superintendent Sylvanus Thayer, the father of the military academy. Beat the dean. So again, it doesn't mean we have an extra 11 minutes being tacked on to a day somehow. This is an average day. The average day is different under the Julian system than under the Gregorian system, and the average day under the Gregorian system gets us much closer to the actual solar cycle, so the calendar is not going to drift as much away from reality if you're using the Gregorian. So now let's take a look at what this removal of some leap years means for the difference between the Julian system and the Gregorian system. We've seen that the Gregorian system omits some leap years where we would have had a leap year under the Julian system in order to keep the calendar more closely aligned with reality, the actual cycle of Earth's relationship to the sun. So let's take a look at one such year, the year 1700. In that year, which would be a leap year under the Julian system, some countries were using the Julian system still in 1700, and some had already switched over to the Gregorian system. Those countries under the Julian system would have a leap year, but we would not have a leap year under the Gregorian system. So if this circle is the Earth coming all the way back around one rotation, one day, and this is the 365th rotation of the year, of the calendar for the Julian system, you're still going to have to rotate one more time before we move to 1701 under the Julian system, because in a leap year you need to do 366 turns. But under the Gregorian system, which will not have a leap year that year, the next Earth rotation is going to start a new calendar year, 1701. And so what does that mean? The Julian system is going to start to fall behind the Gregorian system over the years. So now you should be able to understand why, in order to change from the Julian system to the Gregorian system, the calendar had to speed up during the transition. Because the Julian system tends to fall behind, Pope Gregory stipulated that a certain number of days would be skipped over when switching from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. The longer you wait to make the switch, the more days you would have to skip when you do make the switch. So for a variety of reasons, different countries took different amounts of time arguing and debating the switch before finally making this conversion. Even though Gregory introduced the system in 1582, England and the colonies that would later become the United States did not adopt the Gregorian system until 1752. When they did, they decided that they needed to skip over 11 days when going from the Julian system in order to catch up to where we should be on the Gregorian system, since the Julian system lags the Gregorian system, and over time, the Julian system had lagged the actual solar cycle by an amount that could be corrected by moving the calendar ahead 11 days. So in 1752, when the colonies and England adopted the Gregorian system, they skipped days in September of that year. They made a calendar adjustment in the month of September. After Tuesday, the 1st of September, and then Wednesday, the 2nd of September, the calendar jumped right to the 14th of September the next day. That means that the calendar days of the 3rd through the 13th of September were simply skipped in 1752. How many days were skipped? Well, let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 days were skipped in order to catch the calendar up to where it should be, because the Julian calendar had been lagging by a little bit over the course of the centuries, year by year, and the calendar needed to be shifted. The calendar needed to be shifted to get back in sync with the actual relationship of Earth and Sun. Here's a page from an actual almanac from the year 1752, which shows the month of September 1752. The dates of the month are listed vertically in the left-hand column, starting with the 1st of September at the top and then going downwards. Note that after the 2nd of September, the almanac skips right to the 14th with the removal of those 11 calendar days. So removing those calendar days, the calendar month of September in 1752 had only 19 days instead of 30, which you can see annotated at the top. However, and this is very important to point out, the cycles of the Earth in relationship to the moon, the sun, and the various planets did not change just because the calendar system changed, of course. The Earth and the heavenly bodies continued on their courses. All that changed was that among some men and women on Earth, the calendar numbers that they were using to keep track were altered in order to get the calendar that they were using back in line with the reality in the heavens. No days were actually lost in reality. Only the calendar system that is designed to help us know where we are in the cycles of the solar system was changed. Now, this change was incorporated in 1752 in England and the colonies that would become the United States. And so these internet experts who want to tell you that we're really in the year 2012 instead of 2020 have grabbed onto this change in order to make their argument. They point out that there were 11 days that were skipped in 1752 and that there have now been 268 years since 1752. 2020 minus 1752 is 268 years. So using a bit of deception, a bit of sleight of hand, these Twitter magicians argue that if you multiply 11 days per year times 268 years, you will get 2,948 days. Well, 2,948 days sounds like a lot of years. How many years does 2,948 days represent? Well, if there are about 365 days per year, and you divide 2,948, then 2,948 days equals 8 years. And this is how the Twitter experts make their argument that 2020 should really be 2012. If you subtract 11 days each year for all of those 268 years between 1752 and 2020, then that means you get a total of 8 years that you have to subtract And if you subtract 8 years from 2020, you get 2012. Oh my goodness, 2020 is really 2012. Not really. Because we've now gone through the actual mechanics of the calendar systems, you should be able to see the trick that these deceivers are trying to pull on you. Just because the calendar skipped ahead by 11 days one time when going from the Julian system to the Gregorian system in 1752, because the Julian system falls behind over time and needs an adjustment to catch up, does not mean that we need to add 11 days every single year. That was a one-time adjustment upon switching from the delayed Julian system to the more accurate Gregorian system. The Gregorian system is actually shorter on average by only 11 minutes per year, not 11 whole days per year. So these pranksters who are telling you that 2020 is really 2012 are relying on the fact that most people don't understand all this complicated celestial and calendrical machinery, which is not actually all that hard to understand once you work it out and once you kind of sketch it out and once someone explains it in a systematic way, the way I've tried to explain it in this video. But most people don't think about these kinds of things every day. And so that whole argument that we are still in 2012 is based on sleight of hand. It's based on deliberate deception. And it relies on changing 11 minutes into 11 days, or else it relies on arguing that a one-time switch of 11 days should actually be taking place every single year for the past 268 years. So it's a completely fraudulent argument from the beginning. But even so, as I've already explained, the end of the world in ancient myth has to do with celestial changes in processional ages. Celestial changes, which are invested with esoteric significance in the ancient celestial language of myth, but which are not describing a literal end of the world. They're not describing a terrestrial end of the world. They're describing a shift in the heavens, a shift in the ages, a shift that is most easily noted at the solstices and equinoxes, which is why all these end of the year prophecies usually key in on the solstices. Now, even though this celestial argument that I've laid out is indisputable, it does not mean that some malevolent actors on the world stage are not trying to use end of the age symbolism from ancient myth in order to inflict trauma on people and in order to manipulate world events, either out of their own misinterpretation of the ancient myths as being literal, either because they actually believe that it's literal, or else out of a cynical understanding that millions of people have been misled to believe that they're literal, and using a cynical desire to use that widespread misunderstanding as fuel for inflicting fear and trauma upon the good people of the world. But there's good news at the end of this story. The ancient myths can be conclusively shown to have as one of their central themes the repairing of trauma, the healing of trauma, even though they have been twisted by literalists into a tool for inflicting trauma upon others, and they have been used for centuries to inflict trauma upon men and women in order to enable oppression and enslavement and impoverishment. But as we begin to understand the world's ancient myths in the language that they are actually speaking, which is a celestial language and an esoteric language, we can begin again to hear the profound wisdom which they're designed to convey and the powerful message they have for our lives. It is a message of truth rather than lies, and I am convinced that the truth will prevail. Thank you so much for watching.